I'm Terry Hopmann, professor in the conflict management program here at SAIS. And we are a group of students, 4 students and 2 faculty members, along with 12 other students who are here in the audience today, I believe, who participated in a field trip program during the academic year, including a trip to Seoul, South Korea and the DMZ in January of this year. And we have just completed and published a report about our trip. And the purpose of our session this afternoon is to present some of the major findings of our trip and some of the policy recommendations, and then to have a general discussion about many of the current issues that involve the conflict on the Korean Peninsula between South Korea and North Korea, with obviously the United States having a significant role as well. Obviously, this is a very, very fast changing situation, and a lot has changed since we were in Seoul in January, and even a lot has changed in the last 3 weeks since the final versions of these chapters were prepared by all of the student participants in our trip. So, but on the other hand, I think it's important to emphasize that much of what we found in Seoul actually, I think, revealed much of what has happened since then, and what has happened since then is something that we saw developing, I think, before a lot of people in this country, before a lot of the media and political leaders, in fact, in this country saw these developments. One thing that was very clear to us, I think, during our trip to Seoul is that the government in South Korea was very much concerned about the escalating rhetoric and hostility between the President of the United States and the President of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and saw it as incumbent upon themselves to take the initiative to try to move back from the precipice of a potential nuclear war and to engage in a process of negotiation to try to change the situation on the Korean Peninsula and to move us back from the imminent threat of a nuclear war. And of course, beginning shortly after we returned to this country with the Pyeongchang Olympics and the peace initiatives that occurred there, as well as, of course, the subsequent efforts by the South Korean government to arrange a meeting scheduled to take place sometime in late May or early June between Presidents Trump and Kim Jong-un, and a meeting in which, in fact, of course, the North Korean president has suggested that the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is at least going to be on the negotiating table, though it's not clear exactly what that means to him, nor is it clear how that has been interpreted by his counterparts in the United States, nor is it clear at this point, of course, what the United States and South Korea may have to be prepared to give in order to get from the North Koreans a significant measure of denuclearization over the long term. But nonetheless, the process has been initiated. The 2 presidents of North and South Korea will be meeting tomorrow. And after that, we will see, of course, an unfolding process. So we're obviously, in some sense, in this report already just a little bit behind these rapidly changing events. But nonetheless, I think we have been generally aware, at least, and not all that surprised by all that has happened over the last few weeks and months. So our report today begins with an analysis of the political and military goals of the North Korean regime that have led to the current crisis, which will be summarized by Ariane Noor. And this will be followed by an analysis of some of the challenges facing whatever negotiations eventually develop as a result of these meetings. And Sarah Hudson will present our findings and recommendations on those issues, addressing what needs to be done in order to negotiate a Korean peninsula free of nuclear weapons, and perhaps eventually to move even towards a unification of a divided Korea. In the next section, Charlie Brewer will consider some of the political military issues that need to be resolved, especially if the forthcoming negotiations do not yield a denuclearized Korea. What are some of the alternative options if the negotiations are not completely fruitful in producing their desired goals? And finally, Yun Chen-yan will consider the implications of these developments for the East Asian region as a whole, and specifically for China, Russia, and Japan, important regional players who will be very much affected by the outcome of this process, whatever it may be. And finally, my colleague who accompanied us on this trip, Sinisa Vukovic, we'll summarize our findings and raise some issues for discussion in the question and answer period that will immediately follow. And so we hope you all will have an opportunity to ask some questions. And we have all of the paper writers with us today, I believe. And so if you have questions that pertain to a specific paper other than those represented on the panel, we will also turn to those presenters to enable them to respond to your questions. Again, I'd like to pay special thanks to two sets of groups at SAIS. One is the U.S. Korea Institute at SAIS. Jim Person is here from USKI. It's a very valuable resource that we have at SAIS. And not only for SAIS, but of course for everyone, not only in the United States even, but in the entire world, to get up-to-date information about the rapidly evolving events on the Korean Peninsula. And we very much value their input in helping us prepare for this trip. Finally, of course, I want to pay special attention to Isabel Talpen Long, who is still outside at the desk, but who, as she always does, has done an almost miraculous job of organizing our trip, managing the logistics for it, and above all, producing within a matter of a few days this book, which you all have received out there, which is not only a magical process in itself or outcome in itself, but this is the second of these books, since there was another field trip presentation just 2 weeks ago. So within the last month, she's had to produce and get published 2 books from our 2 field trips. And we can't say enough about the wonderful work that Isabel does for the conflict management program, and particularly for our trip. So without further ado, let me turn the microphone over to Adrienne, and we will proceed down the table from my right to my close right to my far right over here. Your left. Anyway, Adrienne.
Okay. So my section of the book, which was made up of chapters of myself, Alexis Chapman, Jamie Sayer, and Simone Arias over there, it's called Understanding North Korea, which obviously is difficult to do when you can't actually go there. But we tried, and so essentially we kind of looked at the major factors that are influencing North Korean decision-making and behavior. So that's from an ideological perspective, a political, a military perspective, and also from an economic perspective. So starting off with the ideology, my chapter focused on the Juche ideology, which is the political ideology of North Korea. And essentially the major points to know about Juche is it rests on 3 primary pillars, being political independence, economic self-reliance, and national self-defense. And then kind of along with that, it very much pairs with a somewhat binary worldview, in which basically the North sees themselves as existing in a hostile international community where they have to defend their own traditions and way of life against everyone. And that's kind of paired with a pretty significant level of distrust of other parties, including, it's not just distrust of traditional enemies like the United States, it's also distrust of even China and Russia, because they think, throughout history there have been examples of those 2 countries kind of turning their backs a little bit on their allies. So essentially, this ideology was brought to North Korea through Kim Il-sung and really institutionalized at that time. It's still used. Its importance today is still there and still salient, but it is kind of changing a little bit. It's becoming a little bit more malleable, a little bit more flexible, and that's primarily, but it's both from the regime and the society. So. You see the regime, you see Kim Jong-un still pull on Juche for political legitimacy and kind of label things as Juche, even if they don't really fully adhere to the tenets of Juche. And then from society's perspective, some of the North Korean defectors that we spoke with talked about this generational divide, where the older generation who was taught Juche in school, they were around during Kim Il-sung, some of them feel nostalgia towards those times. It's much stronger and more salient for them, whereas for the new generation, it's not quite as embedded in their psyche, these defectors said, and they're a little bit more interested in the outside world, a little bit less interested in isolation. So overall, essentially, the gist is that Juche can help us understand the way that North Koreans perceive foreign acts or foreign statements, but it is changing, and it's important to note that. So then moving on to some of the political and military things that our section looks at. So we all kind of agreed that the ultimate goal of the Kim Jong-un regime is regime security, followed by prestige. And I think with that in mind, Simone looked at some of the major arguments about why militarily the DPRK would be pursuing their nuclear program. And he looks at the aggressive rationale, which says that that the North wants to forcibly reunify the peninsula, but he finds the two other arguments a little bit more salient. The first one being that the nuclear program essentially serves as a defensive deterrent for the North, which would make sense if you consider the pillar of Juche being national self-defense, that they feel that that's the only way to fully back up that self-defense. And then thirdly, I think he is most interesting for him is the concept that the North could be using the nuclear program as a bargaining chip. So in the meantime, as they've been developing their program, it's improved their prestige. And then now that we're going into negotiations, they can use that for different purposes in negotiations. So those kind of different perspectives are all kind of an external perspective. So we also looked, especially Alexis, looked at some of the internal pressures that are on the regime and potentially impacting their decisions. Among them is the fact we heard over and over again that the regime's control over information flows in the country is weakening. For example, there's Wi-Fi available at foreign embassies that a lot of people are trying to gain access to. It's difficult to prevent that. There's also a booming black market. There's also, the ability to bribe officials to get foreign information. And that's obviously a political risk if that were to increase domestic dissatisfaction by being able to look at the foreign world. And then moving into kind of the final economic factors, internally we see that the regime also has kind of loosened control over the markets. This has been a little bit more intentional than the loosening of control over information, especially under Kim Jong-un. He's loosened a lot of the rules over the markets. He's also allowed the black market to increase significantly. In fact, the government actually participates in the black market and illicit activities to maintain to be able to pay their expenditures. They also are struggling now to pay for all military costs, which is important to, it's a political risk because being able to maintain the military is a way of ensuring military loyalty. And then looking now at the external pressures, which especially Jamie talked about, he talks a lot about the impacts that sanctions have had, especially sanctions on remittances now. But I would also just add to that from the Juche perspective that sanctions are kind of double-headed in that they also can be counterproductive. They feed into regime propaganda about this hostile world, and they kind of encourage policymakers in North Korea who say we need to further isolate ourselves to further protect ourselves from sanctions. It also doesn't seem like to some extent, the society is channeling that energy from the economic costs into the black market instead of, potentially pushing back against the government instead. And then he also talks about kind of the different external governments that are impacting the economy, like China, Russia, and South Korea. So China we see is kind of pushing down a little bit more now on the North, but then at the same time we see Russia making up for some of that trade that the North has now lost. He mentions the fact that it's going to be very difficult for China to actually really cut down on the black market trade that occurs across the Chinese-North Korean border. This kind of ebbs and flows. And then finally, with the South, they have to support the economic sanctions, but they also simultaneously are talking a lot about economic cooperation, economic unification to some extent. They mention the new economic map, which is mostly looking at long-term economic trade between North and South. So essentially all of that is just a whole lot of different push and pull factors on the regime that the regime has to take into account when it's making any decision and considering any options. So based off of that, we made a series of recommendations. I'll just talk about a couple of them here. The first would be that we would encourage regional economic cooperation. Like I said, the North is not necessarily super interested in fully integrating into the world economy, but it does seem that they would be potentially interested in operating within, for example, an economic alliance that would be made up of the South, the North, China, Russia, for example. And that might be a way to get them to kind of start to engage more. And then simultaneously, it's important to communicate those economic opportunities to the political elites in the country, because they might be the ones who ultimately are capable of pushing the regime towards those types of policies. We also encourage multiple countries to encourage the spread of information within the DPRK, which is already happening, as I said, but to further push that. And it's not just because that undermines regime propaganda. It's also because, you know, it'll further encourage the society itself to engage with the outside world more. And then finally, we recommend that the U.S. specifically stop making overt threats to the DPRK. This obviously has stopped in the past month or so, since negotiations have been an option. But we would recommend that that would continue, largely because, again, this feeds into this regime narrative and the regime propaganda of this hostile world, and it further pushes the regime towards holding on to the nuclear program as a defensive deterrent. So those are a couple of our points, and I'll stop there, and I'll
Thank you
look
very
forward
much.
to questions.
Sarah.
Sure. So for the second section, there's 5 papers, and in our papers, we discuss negotiating with North Korea. And so these papers consider things like past lessons learned from past negotiations with North Korea, negotiation strategies and tactics, such as problem-solving tactics versus hard bargaining, and the use of sanctions, the intricacies of multilateral treaties, and the issue of unification. And so it's one of the topics, unsurprisingly, it's been the most volatile in the last 4 weeks. And in fact, we were finishing our final drafts when there was the surprise announcement that Trump would meet with Kim Jong-un. So we had to kind of maybe reconfigure some of our analysis. But that being said, I think that there's some good conclusions and recommendations here. So first, I want to turn to Rona Vaslar's paper. And Rona focuses on tactics for dealing with North Korea. And she argues that the United States should use a problem-solving approach when entering negotiations with the DPRK and should focus on trust building. She identifies communication issues between the U.S. and the DPRK as one of the main reasons that past negotiations have failed, as well as a lack of stability, constantly changing regimes, and mutual distrust. Therefore, she argues that Washington and Pyongyang must build trust and communicate more effectively in order to change the dynamic between the two countries. Second, we have Christina Gay, who writes about maximum pressure, maximum opportunity, the strategy of the US, ROK, and Japan. And she also discusses the role of economic sanctions in bringing North Korea to the table. She analyzes the history of sanctions and US ROK policy and discusses how changes in administration in the US and the ROK, and even differences within those administrations, have historically led to changing policies toward North Korea. She also argues that there's a current opening with the reopening of talks and the participation in the Winter Olympics, and that the U.S. and the ROK should explore the possibility of incorporating positive inducements in future dealings with North Korea. Next is my paper about past nuclear negotiations and how lessons can be applied, but also have we passed the point of no return or not on denuclearization. So in a similar vein to Christina and Rona, my paper analyzes past nuclear negotiations, specifically the agreed framework in the 6-party talks, and sort of where those agreements fell short or why they fell apart, either before they were signed or during the implementation process. I identified several factors that contribute to the failures, including poor coordination between allies, changes in administration, policy inconsistency, misinterpretations of the North Korean regime, and then failure to follow through, most importantly. Secondly, I attempted to address the question of what's different today and whether Kim Jong-un was truly willing to give up nuclear weapons, and if not, what options the U.S. has to move forward. And although it's now been announced that Kim is potentially willing to denuclearize, I think we should still proceed with caution and try to figure out what that means to Kim Jong-un, given the constantly changing situation. So next, kind of moving away from just direct negotiations, I'm going to talk about Scott Sloat talked about the United Nations and global non-proliferation treaties, including the NPT, as well as the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty and the Chemical Weapons Convention. And so Scott argues that in order to denuclearize, it's important to look back at current treaties as they are now, but also lessons learned about the ways that North Korea, even while it was a signatory for 18 years, was still able to develop nuclear weapons. And he argues the international community must make serious efforts to address these issues and these gaps and take further action and more technical mechanisms and additional assurances. And lastly, Zhang Liang talks about the unification of the two Koreas. And although some are skeptical that unification is possible or desirable in the current context, it's still a point of rhetoric that we heard over and over on our trip. And it will be one that will need to be addressed in any negotiations between the two countries. And so she explores several possible unification scenarios. The first would be a unification like what occurred in Vietnam, where unification is a result of regime collapse and the surprise attack. And she concluded this was unlikely, probably. The second, which we actually heard while we were at the Ministry of Unification, was similar to Germany, the German model, where North Korea would suddenly collapse and then be absorbed by South Korea. And the third option was two coexistent states like the China-Hong Kong model, where there are independent economic and administrative systems, but politically, Hong Kong submits to China. So, lastly, recommendations. I'm not going to cover all the recommendations because there's 5 papers, so please look at the book. But unsurprisingly, we had some similar thoughts, given that we had some overlap in our papers. Lots of us talked about trust-building measures as being very important before negotiations and then continuing after. Rona and Christina also talked about positive incentives for North Korea that the U.S. and South Korea should consider. And Jiang and Christina talked about the removal of economic sanctions and recommended economic cooperation measures between the North and the South. Christina and I both recommended that there be significant planning and preparation prior to any negotiations. And we also talked about the need for resolving internal differences in U.S. policy and recommended bipartisan committees and bipartisan delegations. Scott and I also talked about verification and the need for verification and a focus on implementation, even after an agreement might be signed. And lastly, we all talked about the need to coordinate with allies and regional parties, including Russia and China. We recommended to those parties that they support bilateral talks and that we need policy coordination among parties in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Charlie?
Good afternoon. I am going to be presenting a series of papers that talk about some of the more strategic and defense-related issues that we grappled with over the course of this trip. I think it will come as no surprise to you that a lot of the recommendations in this section of the paper coming from a group of conflict management-minded students almost unanimously call for cooler heads and everyone just chilling out a little bit. But the first paper is one by Kari Kagawa, and her paper talks about or discusses the strength and effectiveness of U.S. extended deterrence on the Korean Peninsula in light of existing efforts to transfer operational control, known as OPCON, of U.S. and Korean forces in Korea, which are known as the Combined Forces Command, or CFC. Carrie had a lot of acronyms in her paper. So right now, the Command Forces Command is under the operational control of a 4-star U.S. general with a 4-star Korean general as the deputy commander. And Carrie describes in her paper that there have been long-standing plans to transfer that operational control from the 4-star U.S. general to 4-star Korean general. But she notes that because the projection of a strong U.S. ROK alliance remains essential for maintaining peace and stability in the region, there are some issues that this OPCON transfer could present. Opponents of the transfer state that it will make the alliance appear weak, and as if the U.S. is backing away from its commitments on the peninsula. They also note that it might be unrealistic to assume that anyone in the United States defense complex would be comfortable having United States troops under the command, potentially, or the control, rather, of a foreign general, something that the U.S. has historically been very, very, very reluctant to do. Supporters of the transfer argue that this will actually have little impact on U.S. extended deterrence, and that the ROK military has somewhat atrophied under the existing system as they've become reliant on the U.S. Forces in Korea for direction in their defense. They also, or supporters of the transfer, also remark that an OPCON transfer would help address DPRK propaganda that asserts that the Republic of Korea is just a puppet of the United States. Ultimately, Kerry in her paper argues that the time right now is ripe for the OPCON transfer to happen, especially given the positions of both President Trump and President Moon in South Korea. And she recommends that the United States and South Korea maintain and publicly reaffirm the U.S. extended deterrence posture on the Korean Peninsula, and that they renew the Mutual Defense Treaty that they signed in 1953. Kerry also noted in her paper that it would be vital that the United States appoint a senior and knowledgeable ambassador to South Korea, and this actually just happened a few days ago, so I'm glad someone's listening to Kerry. Recently, Admiral Harry Harris, who is the PACOM commander, was nominated to be the new ambassador to South Korea from the United States, and I would think this goes hand in hand with exactly what Kerry had recommended. She also recommends that over the course of this transfer, the ROK take a much larger role in leading confidence-building outreach campaigns, both with U.S. forces that are in Korea and also leading joint exercises in the area. The next kind of strategic topic that was discussed in this section was written by Sheng Zheng, and she discussed the utility of THAAD deployments on the Korean Peninsula. For those of you who are not in the know about THAAD, THAAD stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, and it is a missile defense system that the United States produces. So in her paper, Shun weighs the effects of South Korea's recent deployments of U.S. THAAD missile defense systems on its territory. She argues that although the United States and the ROK, the Republic of Korea, state that the THAAD systems are essential to address the threat posed by North Korean missiles, their deployments are of little real utility to the U.S. and the ROK, and further complicate the relationships between both parties and China. In her paper, she notes that THAAD provides little deterrent value against a North Korean attack on Seoul, whose population sits within range of the immense conventional armaments that line North Korea's border with the South, and fails to meaningfully contribute to U.S. extended deterrence in the region. Additionally, she argues that Chinese perceptions of the threat posed by THAAD have resulted in elevated tension in the region and have complicated the relationship between Korea and China and the U.S. at a time when clarity of intent is essential to resolving the crisis on the peninsula. To this end, she recommends that the U.S. and the ROK reassess the effectiveness of THAAD deployments as tools to promote stability in the region, reaffirm U.S. defense commitments to South Korea, and defend South Korean territory from any DPRK activity. She also encourages that leveraging a reassessment of those deployments could offer an opportunity for the South Koreans, U.S., and Chinese to work even closer together than they already are to trying to find a peaceful solution to the problem on the peninsula. And finally, this is a paper that I wrote for this section, and this was at least my attempt to assess the tactical value of the North Korean nuclear weapons and what the world could expect from Kim Jong-un once he has completed his ballistic missile programs. Historically, the DPRK has engaged in provocative offensive actions across the border, such as shelling Yongpyong Island and sinking a South Korean submarine in 2010. And many people worry that they will continue to engage in escalated provocative activity with conventional forces once their ballistic missile program is complete. To examine the validity of this concern, I looked to the 1999 Kargil conflict between Pakistan and India, fought shortly after Pakistan had completed its first nuclear weapons tests, which began after Pakistan crossed the line of control dividing Kashmir to seize territory surrounding the town of Kargil in the Indian area of control. This conflict is commonly referenced during debates over the utility of nuclear weapons and debates regarding the existence of the what's called the stability-instability paradox. This paradox suggests that opposing states that possess stable nuclear deterrence capable of mutually assured destruction are more likely to engage in small conventional conflicts due to their assumption that the conflict will never escalate to the nuclear level. In other words, this suggests that nuclear weapons can provide cover for states to pursue revisionism or other foreign military excursions by conventional means. Although determining the subtle motivations of parties in conflict is often difficult, I leverage the scholarship of T. Nagin Pagahi and others to argue that the Pakistani military did not view its newly developed nuclear arsenal as capable of providing cover for this operation, and India did not moderate its response to the incursion out of fear of nuclear escalation. Ultimately, the outcome of the Kargil conflict suggests that the utility of nuclear weapons, including those possessed by Kim Jong-un, is limited to classical deterrence. Based on this analysis, I assessed that the DPRK is unlikely to engage in escalated conventional provocations under the cover of its nuclear arsenal, and recommend that, much like the recommendations that Carrie put forward in her paper, the U.S. reaffirm the strength of their alliance with South Korea and make very clear the red lines that they will consider, or the responses that would accompany any crossing actions that the DPRK might undertake following the completion of its ballistic missile program. I also have a recommendation here for North Korea, just to remark that Pakistan's post-nuclear experiences suggest that Kim Jong-un's nuclear weapons will be useful only as tools of defensive deterrence. Thank you.
Sure. So our section mainly covers the interest and also policies and also our policy recommendations for the regional players in the Northeast Asia, that is including China, Russia, and Japan. And we also discuss the possibility and perspective of developing a cooperative security mechanism in this region. So firstly, my paper on China interest. So China is usually considered unwilling to push North Korea towards fully denuclearization because of its own insecurities, including the foreseeable inflow of the refugees as a border, and also North Korea's value as a buffer state between China and South Korea, which is a key U.S. ally. And the U.S. military presence and potential expansion in Northeast Asia has long been bothering the Chinese government. As far as Chinese policy, so China has been pretty cooperative in the latest round of the international economic sanctions, but however, China may reverse its policies if it perceives the United States to be hostile and ambitious in expanding its regional military presence, which will again highlight the strategic value of North Korea as a buffer state, which may lead to China to loosen its sanctions. However, the sanction is actually the key to bring and maintain North Korea on the negotiation table. So our policy recommendation for this is for the United States and China to maintain tight cooperation on, firstly, to develop a joint contingency plan, and second, to hold on to the economic sanctions. And our second recommendation is for the design of the sanction, that is to target North Korean overseas networks that the Kim regime has been employing to maintain access to hard currency and materials for their testing and also for the national economy. And the second paper by Chris Barnes is on the Russian interest and policy. So Moscow has been very similar to that of China, that is to sticking to the stability first position and opposes a pressure and sanctions-oriented strategy. So the policy rationality behind this is firstly, Russia usually regard itself as a great power, so it wants its presence in the process for a conflict to be settled, to be filled by the international community. And also, Russia do this because of the economic opportunity behind North Korea. So firstly, the bilateral trade between these two countries. And second, the potential to develop great substantial infrastructure-related projects in North Korea. And also the potential for Russian access through North Korea to markets in the Asian Pacific, which is to increase and improve Russian Far East infrastructure interoperability. And so the Russian policy has been very similar to China again. So that is to the double freeze and also dual track solution, aiming at denuclearization as well as a peace treaty on the Korean Peninsula. So our policy recommendation regarding this, that is to include Moscow's interest, that is including the economic pursuit, and also Russia's desire to be seen internationally as a great power and a global deal maker in any deal that's going to emerge from Pyongyang, Seoul, Washington talks as a way of securing their buy-in for any agreement. And the third paper is by Zinzi Thompson. It's about Japan. So today, Japan is primarily concerned that a nuclearized and antagonistic North Korea can threaten its very existence. And North Korea is probably going to use dialogue as a means to buy time for developing their nuclear capabilities, so which is a lesson learned by Japan from the six-party talks. And the third one is North Korean abduction of Japanese nationals, so which is a domestic concern for Japan. And the Japan's policy, Japan has been a very firm supporter of a US-led maximum pressure campaign, so which has been focusing on economic sanctions. And as North Korea continues to enhance its nuclear capabilities and threaten Japan, the Japanese government may come under increasing pressure to normalize the SDF, that is a self-defense force, by amending its constitutions, which will add to the historical tensions between Japan and its neighbors in Northeast Asia, especially China and South Korea. So our recommendation is, firstly, to continue to closely engage Japan about the development that can affect North Korean crisis, including the provision of any incentives in the negotiation. And second, for Japan, Japan should work closely to enhance its relationship with its North Asian neighbors, including both government and the republic, especially China and South Korea. And lastly, Batuga envisioned a cooperative security mechanism in this region, so of which the significance will go beyond a regional and organizational response to this nuclear crisis, but with broader meaning. So by definition, cooperative security is a process whereby countries work jointly through agreed mechanisms to reduce tensions, resolve disputes, and build confidence, enhance economic development, and maintain stability, which will be superior to the current regional landscape because, firstly, it will be inclusive, subject-focused, so as to be instrumental in preventing wars and conflicts. And second, it will strengthen the current efforts in preventing proliferation in this region. And third, it will boost aggregate economic growth through regional economic integration. And lastly, it will enable the regional players to address common problems that no one country can singly address, such as environment, energy, infrastructure, and terrorism. So our recommendation for this is firstly, regional multilateralism should be based on the multi-layered and comprehensive approach that is a division of labors for different member states. And second, Mongolia can play the role of a third party in hard security issues, leveraging its friendly relations with all other regional countries.
Thank you. Before turning it over to Sinisa, let me remind you that you're all invited to a reception after our panel is over and we have some Korean food. So don't rush off, stay around and we can chat informally over some good Korean food before you all go home. Sinisa.
Thank you. First of all, let me express my utmost gratitude to students for writing such a comprehensive, elaborate, and very clear set of policy recommendations, which on such a timely subject. It has been a pleasure to participate in this endeavor, and it's an equal pleasure to see the output that came out. I strongly recommend it to the audience to take a look at this report because it provides a very unique outlook on how this ongoing crisis needs to be managed or can be managed potentially. And such a complexity cannot be summarized in 5 to 10 minutes of my talk, but I'll try my best to kind of bring the main obstacles or the main challenges in order to manage this conflict. And reflecting on what the students have written about, it's the easiest way to do it is to kind of summarize it, cluster it into the classic conflict management approach, and that is looking at the paradox or the issue of diagnosis, the issue of formulas or the solutions that are being sought, and then the issue of how the end game should look like or what the end game is supposed to be eventually. And we can see that on all these three levels, we can find various paradoxes that hamper significant progress, and that the progress that we're observing right now is actually going beyond the conventional way of looking at the conflict. So the first level is the paradox of a shared diagnosis, which is actually missing or has been missing largely when it comes to what this conflict is all about. And in our trip, and students have addressed this very carefully, in our trip we actually saw competing ways of looking at the conflict. Before the trip and after, and during the trip we saw that the conflict was mirrored or viewed through different lenses, and from those lenses came different solutions, and from those solutions came different prospects of how the conflict should be shaped. So the conventional way of looking at it is this is an intractable conflict which also has a significant dimension that is shaped by the nuclear proliferation on behalf of North Korea. And if this is an intractable conflict, then one needs to ask, how come we are seeing this progress right now? And Sarah just touched upon it in her remarks, and I will reiterate this, that what we are seeing now is that something was done to make this stalemate that existed for more than 50 years less self-serving. In fact, it is a lesson to show that this intractability is not indefinite, nor it is perpetual. It actually is dynamic, and it's shaped by specific decisions that are undertaken on the ground. And these decisions that we are seeing right now prompt a curiosity. How come South Korea became so invested now compared to previous times? And what we saw in the trip as well is that more and more voices are perceiving an encroachment on behalf of South Korea, that they feel that they are stuck in this conflict and that they need to come out of it on their own. So they have their own diagnosis compared to the diagnosis of North Koreans. And the North Koreans diagnose it as just an offshoot, a spin-off of the conflict that stopped in 1953 but never terminated or ended ever since, and that this is just a prolongation of that conflict. And then on the American side, what we can also hear from kind of different decision makers and opinion makers, we can see that this is primarily a nuclear issue, nothing else. And if we have such a diversity in the shared diagnosis, we can also understand why the solution has not been sufficiently clear or sufficiently compatible. And what is unique about this report is that it offers a set of very creative ways to go beyond this paradox of lack of proper solution. Because maybe we are now in a stalemate that is becoming more susceptible to ripeness. But what really is missing, and I'm borrowing from Professor Hopmann's theory here, what is really missing are these enticing opportunities for the parties that they can get hooked on, that they can start thinking about as a way out of this predicament. In order to make them as such, what students are presenting here is a set of confidence-building measures and creative solutions that go beyond just immediate fixes. And this immediate solutions may not be enough, may actually exacerbate the conflict, and may not address those trigger mechanisms and pressure points that can continue conflict, but in a different form. So it is always very useful to look at what these confidence measures should be. And Christina and Rona and the others, they're actually presenting confidence building measures both as a unilateral move and a search for cooperative moves as well. So it can be on both ends of the story. Most of these kind of confidence building measures require some form of costly concessions. And this is one of the biggest problems about the conflict management in this conflict, is that finding a way to politically justify these costly concessions makes it less likely that someone is going to make that first move. So it's very interesting now to observe, is this really a first move, what we are seeing right now as an attempt to at least start the dialogue? But then the question is, on what and for how long? And is it going to trickle up or trickle down onto different issues? Which brings me to the last point, and that is the paradox of what the end game should look like. We have short-term gains and long-term ambitions that oftentimes may be at each other's odds. And if the diagnosis that Simon produced is that one of the rationales for pursuing a nuclear program by North Korea is regime survival, and this echoes throughout the report, it's a strong bargaining chip, but if it's taken away right away, it needs another costly concession or reciprocal move on behalf of the United States or South Korea together. And that is some form of guarantee for the regime. But then the question is, do they want to preserve the regime? And what we found in the strip is also very interesting, and it does not get really spoken about in the United States as much, and that is the willingness to unify in South Korea. It is dwindling down. It is being smaller and smaller over time, and that prospect of unification as a carrot, unification as a potential panacea, is losing traction. So this type of kind of short-term perspective, hoping that it may evolve into a potential unification, is getting less and less potential as a package deal that can be sought, both short-term and long-term. So we see different paradoxes, from competing diagnoses to competing solutions to competing prospects of what the end game should look like, which make this conflict so complex and which make this conflict so difficult to break through and break from. But the ongoing talks that are happening show that negotiations actually are the most cost-efficient way out, because given the deterrent techniques and given the brinkmanship that we are observing, if we follow that alternative, we can see that the costs are exponentially higher. So as a good conflict management academic, and you as future conflict management practitioners, you have came up with a set of good solutions that I urge the audience now to kind of give a close look and critically examine the extent of their applicability. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, we will now open the floor to questions. Isabel has a microphone here, and if you are addressing your question to a specific individual, please indicate who. Otherwise, if you're addressing it to the panel in general,
Hi, thank you. Thank you for this really comprehensive report. I'm excited to read more about it, and it's good to be back at SAIS. I have one niche question, which I think is more for Chris, which hearing about your topic, we heard about opportunities that Russia could see in negotiations over the peninsula. I'm curious if Russia could play a role of a spoiler. Is there any interest that Russia might have in a conflict or a continued stalemate? And then I don't want to hog the questions, but I feel like we need to address Donald Trump in the room, just generally maybe looking at the tactics that Charles looked at, and then Ariane with the North Korean perspective. I think I heard everything that's happening characterized as progress, but what do you all see as the risks of Donald Trump brinkmanship and misreading of signals and things like that?
Okay. Chris, why don't you get the first one there on Russia?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron, for the question. About Russia's role as a player in this situation, negotiations, in the conflict, and as a potential spoiler. That is something that is maybe not explicitly spelled out, their role as a potential spoiler in the report, but it does touch on, as I think In-Chen did sort of allude to, that their interests absolutely have to be taken into consideration and paid sufficient attention to, because they do have the role, a potential to play a role of a spoiler, just purely through their positive relations with the North Koreans that they have, with the incentives that they could potentially offer North Korea to reject a settlement, either through infrastructure investment, through continued violations of the sanctions, which reports have indicated that the Russians have been allowing, if not from the Kremlin expressly endorsing. And so there is the danger that if an agreement is reached that does not essentially have enough incentives for Russia to give its stamp of approval to, that they could start to make diplomatic waves with the North Koreans, with Beijing as well, to scuttle any potential deal. So it is going to be very important for the American and South Korean negotiators to be aware of what their positions are, what incentives they are paying attention to, and what kind of deal will be able to pass muster with Moscow.
We'd like to deal with the Trump question.
I'm happy to take the first shot.
Okay.
It's an excellent question, especially about the risks for miscalculation. And I think a lot of what was reported in this book and a lot of what was set up on the panel reflects our collective determination that the parties are rational and want to exist in as safe a manner as possible, but that the big concern is about a miscalculation of the Kim regime feeling as if they are stuck in a use it or lose it scenario for their weapons, or feel overtly threatened by any sort of move by the United States or South Korea or anybody else. And I don't have, a lot of the recommendations that we had put forth sought, I think, to minimize the risk of that happening, and especially now with the potential opportunity for Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un to meet. I think in the run-up to that, we've seen certainly a de-escalation in rhetoric on both sides about the conflict in general. And that, I think, is in line with what we had recommended or what we had hoped would happen from a minimizing the risk of miscalculation. I think one thing that still is up for discussion, and really nobody knows what's going to happen, but if President Trump and Kim meet and it doesn't go well, what happens after that? Does it just kind of go back to business as usual? Is there any sort of rough framework pulled together that I'm less willing to speculate on? I don't know if anyone else has any other comments.
I can make a comment. So I struggled this a little bit when I was writing my paper, definitely. As I mentioned, the surprise announcement kind of threw a few of my conclusions. I had to reconsider them. But I looked historically at negotiations, specifically in the Bush administration and the Clinton administration. And I've been struck in the last 4 weeks, about kind of some of the similarities to the past. For example, throwing out old agreements or solutions, tactics, just because they were your political opponents or the presidency before. And that goes for both the Republic of Korea and the U.S. And so it seems that that's happening again, and I don't think that's necessarily a good thing, although you could argue either way. Another thing that I want to emphasize is that particularly I've been seeing kind of history doesn't echo, but it rhymes, with the presence of John Bolton on Trump's team. You can see definitely what implications that might have, because he was also involved in the Bush administration. And also that in my paper, I looked at implementation. And once an agreement is made, what's on the table doesn't necessarily mean that an agreement is going to work long term. And so Trump and Kim might meet and they might agree on something, but what happens afterward is still really important. And so I am hoping that the U.S. is focusing resources not only on a lot of preparation for this meeting, but for the meetings that will have to come after.
Let me just add that one thing that struck me with particularly some of the North Korea specialists we talk about, the South Koreans who specialize in analysis of the North Korean regime, is the concern of the regime about the inconsistency in U.S. policy, as Sarah mentions, from one administration to another, from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration, and the collapse of the agreed framework is an historic event that was obviously very prominent in the eyes of North Koreans. And concerns, again, that this could happen as well with additional agreements. And I think of particular importance here in terms of confidence building, which a number of people emphasized, is the necessity of both South Korea and the United States to have some kind of consistent policy, which, as Sarah, I think, also suggested in her presentation, would include some sort of more bipartisan approach to policy that would give the North Korean government some confidence. Perhaps in the immediate future, it seems to me the thing that is most important in terms of the signals from the Trump administration will be whether or not they pull out of the Iran agreement. If they pull out of the Iran agreement, I cannot imagine any circumstance under which Kim Jong-un would want to even meet with him, much less agree to anything with him. How can you trust the United States government to fulfill an agreement that it might make with the North Koreans if it pulled out of an agreement, of a very similar agreement with Iran? If that happens, I think that will be a critical decision and a critical mistake in terms of trying to create an appropriate confidence basis for any negotiations between the United States and the North Korean regime. Bill?
I had two questions. One, I guess, to Chung Jung. I'm still baffled about THAAD. It seems to me to be an ultimately or quintessentially defensive weapon, and therefore I can't see why it's offensive in the non-military sense to China. And maybe that could be explained. And I didn't quite find that in a quick look at the chapter. And the other question is, how can the other parties be folded into what I guess essentially starts out as a two-party talk? The next candidate is South Korea, who has offered to be present. I'm not sure that was gratefully received. And then if South Korea is going to be present, how do they fold in Japan? And then what about going to the six-party talks? Seems to be some kind of a succession that has to, people waiting at the door that has to be handled.
Okay, let me turn the THAAD question to Cheng, who has in her paper some of the Chinese technical arguments about THAAD and its threat to China.
Yeah, thank you for this detailed question. So I want to present here a Chinese perspective on that potential threat. So THAAD technically, it is designed, the radar is designed in a way that it can observe China's missile flying to the northeast direction, as it is originally positioned to observe the potential ones from North Korea, and it will enable the U.S. to gather important data on Chinese missiles in the sense that because it is positioned that is observe the missiles from the back end instead of the front end, and from the back end the area is much larger, and it is so it is easier for them to detect whether it is a decoy warhead or a real warhead. I think that particularly is a concern for the China side. And also in terms of the utility, of a THAAD, I think two reasons. One is that I argue that it can potentially protect South Korea from threats from North Korea. However, Seoul is so adjacent to North Korea that THAAD, as a higher tier missile defense system, cannot protect it compared to its previous system, for example, Patriot system. And secondly, in an event of a preventive attack, there's nothing actually can deal with retaliation. So that do not have a lot of role to play in this case. So I think due to the two reasons, I argue that that would actually have potential technical threat to China, and South Korea should really be able to weigh the different concerns and be able to make a more sensible decision to whether deploy or not. And right now, even though it is already in the process deploying, there are some technical options that we can potentially pursue. For example, changing the configuration of the radar to some other radars so that it would have less precision, or it would have the angle would be slightly different. Sorry, I'm not a technical expert on this, but technically there are some ways to adjust it somehow so that it would decrease China's concerns as well as given the system is still there. I hope this is a somewhat efficient answer to your
Thank you.
question.
On the multilateralism question, let me turn first to Batulga, who wrote a chapter about multilateralism, and then there may be some other parts of the question we can unpack as well, though.
Thank you so much. I didn't view the solution to North Korean nuclear crisis from the perspective of six-party talks. I think, in my opinion, it's better to tackle the nuclear issue bilaterally or trilaterally between North Korea and the United States, or maybe with South Korea. And what I think as an important aspect of the negotiation on North Korean nuclear crisis is finding the best venue. And I'm following the news recently about the potential venues for the negotiation. And as of now, the best two venues for the negotiation between the United States and North Korea are Mongolia and Singapore. So I want to say a few words about the potential of Mongolia as a venue. And should I proceed?
Please
or
go ahead.
Is it
Speaking
relevant?
of Mongolian.
I'm talking about Mongolia. I'm from Mongolia. Logistically speaking, it's the closest, and also it enjoys friendly relations with all the other countries in Northeast Asia, and also it's between Russia and China, the two countries which have very complicated relations with the Trump administration now, and holding the negotiations in Mongolia would demonstrate, in my opinion, the superpower outreach of the United States. And in the wrapping up what I said, I don't think going back to the six-party talks and holding it in Beijing would be feasible and doable. I think the current bilateral negotiation, is a better solution, and that's what North Korea wants to do, solving the issue bilaterally. And I don't know if that answers your question, but that's my opinion. Thank you.
Okay, another aspect of the sort of enlargement of it internationally, I think, is the non-proliferation regime and the role that the IAEA played and would have to play, presumably, in designing some kind of an appropriate implementation process, which several of the papers talked about. But I wonder if Scott would like to say just a word or two about what role the IAEA and other global international institutions might play also in supporting the process, even if they're not a direct participant in the negotiation, but whose technical knowledge is necessary to make any kind of an agreement of this sort effective.
Yes, so for my paper, I wrote mainly about the NPT and several other multilateral treaties. And I wrote specifically about some of the weaknesses of the NPT. And one of them was that there's an inadequate safeguards system involved with the IAEA. So right now, when a country joins the NPT, they sign what's called a Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, which enables IAEA inspectors to inspect facilities that are declared by the country that signs the agreement. Unfortunately, as was the case with North Korea, the IAEA was unable to inspect clandestine facilities that North Korea had not declared. And so one of the possible solutions is what's called the Model Additional Protocol, which would, right now it's a voluntary measure for countries to sign, but it would allow the IAEA inspectors to look into facilities that the country has not necessarily declared. One possible solution with North Korea is that if there is an agreement reached at all, it could do what was done with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, where North Korea may be obliged to sign the Model Additional Protocol, which would allow IAEA inspectors to go to any facility, whether or not it was declared by the regime. And so it goes to show that there's great potential of the IAEA and the NPT that I think often gets overlooked in discussions of this crisis.
Sarah, do you want to say anything about the 640 talks beyond what you said in your initial presentation?
Sure.
As a model for future negotiations, is this appropriate, or is it better to keep it
I did
bilateral
address it in my
bilateral?
paper briefly. So just to say briefly, and I'm not sure if Christina, if you did it all, but generally, I think most of us concluded that bilateral talks were more feasible right now, and that probably two sets of bilateral talks specifically, where it's the U.S. and the DPRK, and then South Korea and North Korea. And just that multilateral talks wouldn't necessarily be helpful right now, but that there would need to be policy coordination still with the other members of the six-party talks. I also think that they might possibly be important in the future after perhaps the main issues are resolved for verification or for future goals such as regional economic or security cooperation. So.
I'll just add a quick point to that because I actually wrote my capstone on the six-party talks.
Okay.
And the question of whether the six-party talks themselves are a good model for future negotiations, I think, is answered by the fact that there was pretty much no progress made in the six-party talks until it was essentially a bilateral negotiation between the U.S. and North Korea. And the biggest issue, both before that point and going forward, after they actually come to what was called the September Agreement, which was signed in 2005, and they had two phases of implementation that essentially collapsed over the issues of verification and inspections and declarations. A lot of the problems that emerged were due to failure, exactly as Sarah said, failure to coordinate provision of incentives to the North Koreans with the Japanese and the South Koreans. And again, as I was saying in response to Aaron's question, coordination with China and Russia will also be essential, even if the negotiations themselves proceed in a bilateral context. And I think joint statements with the North Koreans about any progress that is made will be possibly effective in conveying to all the other relevant parties what's happening, and as we move forward through the negotiations, talking in a bilateral sense with Russia and South Korea and China and Japan about, are their interests being represented? Is there something that they are looking for? Like with Japan, the abductee issue is obviously going to be a major factor in any agreement for them. And so the United States, in a sense, has to do, I would argue, bilateral negotiations with multilateral considerations as they go forward.
I should mention that the negotiation practicum at a different time did a simulation of the seventh session of the six-party talks and made significant progress.
I ran a similar one at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy with Koreans a couple of years ago. They didn't make much progress, I'm afraid. But anyway, other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. Excellent panel. So 2 questions. Can you envision some creative win-win strategy for resolution, maybe something a little outside the box? And also, who are the best trusted third parties, mediators, and processes that would have optimal effect, positive effect on both sides?
Who would like to deal with that one?
Win-win.
Go ahead, Charlie.
There's one interesting, well, the most creative proposal I have seen to date was, I think, drafted or written by a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School. That he made the argument that a potential solution to at least improving the likelihood that the Kim regime would denuclearize would be to station Russian troops in North Korea, similar to how U.S. troops are stationed in South Korea. The viability of that is incredibly up for debate, but it was still the first time I'd seen any very novel solution proposed. I am a doubter that would ever be possible in any way, but if you're looking for creativity, this professor wrote a very charismatic article about it.
I'm probably gonna add one point. Yeah, my answer is probably not that relevant because my answer is like there used to be an opportunity, a window for us to solve this question under the cooperation between the United States and China, but that is already passed because of the announcement of the Trump-Kim summit. So I feel like China has this very strong signal released in last November when China held a very strict implementation of the international economic sanctions against North Korea. So that, according to my understanding, can be a signal that China is considering cooperating with the United States on more harshly, like go after North Korea. I don't know what their precise plan is, but that's a very strong signal. Like U.S.-China can literally or sincerely cooperate on solving North Korea as a problem. So North Korea is no longer a strategic value or asset for China, because there used to be a domestic policy debate within China last year. So some scholars were arguing, is North Korea really an asset or a liability for us? And is it really the time for us to reflect on the policy failure on North Korea? That is where we're indulging them, like to enhance their nuclear capabilities in the past. So, but I think that window is already closed because Trump tried to take a detour to avoid China in directly negotiating with North Korea. So, which has added to China's suspicion, and I don't think that scenario is very likely in the future. But it used to exist in the past.
I can just say about, I'm not sure, I'm writing my capstone on mediation. So I'm not sure there's really a credible or a possible third-party mediator here, because one of the preconditions for mediation working is both parties being willing to accept a mediator. I mean, I know, so I don't think any of the parties in the six-party talks really could mediate because I think they're too involved and wouldn't be acceptable to one or the other or both. I know the Swiss have offered, but I don't know if that would be acceptable to anyone or if anyone's taken them up on that. Maybe Mongolia, I don't know, but been surprised by a lot in the last couple of weeks, so maybe, yeah.
Maybe just to conclude, I'd like to ask the people, particularly those who focused on negotiations, what does if the goal is denuclearization of North Korea, what does the United States and South Korea have to give to get that? I mean, negotiations always involve giving something to get something, and it's pretty clear what we would like to get from North Korea, but what are we prepared to give, what would we need to give in order to have any chance of convincing the regime in North Korea that they would move towards denuclearization? I don't know if Rona or Christina. Rona, why don't you?
Hi, everyone. I'm Rona, and I wrote on the negotiation strategies that would work, I think, with North Korea. And one of the things that I think a lot of times people in the U.S. don't really understand is that what North Korea really, really wants is the assurance that we're not going to try to topple their regime. The Kim regime wants very much to stay in power, unsurprisingly. And a lot of the rhetoric that the U.S. has used in the past has been focused on, we need to take down these evil people. Well, that's got a pretty clear intent to destroying the regime, which is really kind of the impetus behind their whole nuclear program. So I think if the U.S. could find a way to convince them that we don't actually want to destroy their regime, then I think that they would be a lot more willing to at least enter negotiations with good faith. I think that's the most important first step, is they have to believe that we're not out to get them and destroy their government and take over. And even though we might think that that's ridiculous, why would we ever want to actually go and do that? That's their number one concern, and that has to be alleviated before we can make any real progress.
One thing we consistently heard from South Korean specialists on North Korea is that Kim Jong-un does not want to become Saddam Hussein or Muammar Gaddafi. And if you give up nuclear weapons, your regime will be overthrown and you'll end up either executed or dead in a culvert alongside the highway. That clearly is something that is totally unacceptable to the regime. And how you persuade them that the United States can give them a reliable guarantee of that variety if they give up their nuclear weapons seems to me to still be the big question you have to overcome. We have one question here in the back, and then we're going to have to bring our session to a close. Christina, do you want to comment on it? Well, I'll get you in here. But let's get this last question and then.
Stanley Kober. We've been looking at this as United States with North Korea. Russia has been mentioned as a spoiler, but Russia and China together have both explicitly stated, I'm looking at a Reuters report citing Xinhua, the two leaders agreed to stick to the goal of denuclearization in the Korean Peninsula. The two leaders are Xi and Putin. Why would they publicly affirm that North Korea must denuclearize? And I see this a lot. It's not just the United States.
Okay.
I'll take it.
Chuck, would you like to comment on that? Or Chen, you want to?
Yeah,
I mean,
for sure.
you can talk about China, I think, on that.
Yeah, so China's
Why?
primary interest in this region or in any other kind of region is the stability. So regional stability is like the precondition for security and also economic development. So I feel like if China perceives a nuclearized North Korea is how am I going to say, can constitute a more compelling danger than how am I going to say, denuclearized one. I think China has the motivation to push the denuclearization, in which China has strongly or explicitly or significantly singled out last year. So so China's primary concern is still security. So nuclearized North Korea is not that stable given the North Korean rhetoric and also its threat of using the nukes. So I don't know if that answered your question, Lori.
Chris, do you want to add anything about Russia on that?
I could. I certainly sympathize with the notion that Russia and China see a denuclearized Korean Peninsula as in both their interests. And I know quite a bit more about Russia than I do China, so I'll set them aside. But as far as Russia goes, I would say that if Russia perceives, I would say on the one hand, I don't know about most of the people in this room. I don't really know how far I would trust Vladimir Putin and what he says these days. He's kind of shown himself to sort of say one thing and do several different others. And that trickles down throughout his government, I would argue. But setting aside the potential for deception or anything, I think that if the Kremlin perceives an agreement as against their interests, and there are many ways which they calculate and perceive those interests, economically above all, I would argue, in that region, because they are in a period of attempting to assert themselves more forcefully in the Far East and have been for about the past, basically since Putin came back into office. If they perceive a deal to denuclearize North Korea as being opposed to their interests, it's, in my view, pretty likely that they would put pressure to either modify the deal or potentially to spoil its completion or implementation, because they would perceive their own interests, I think, as more fundamental than simply the denuclearization. Because stability, I think they believe, can be maintained even with a nuclear North Korea. And so if their interests are not represented in an agreement, they're not going to just sit there and let it happen.
Okay. Christina, did you want to comment on the earlier question about the necessary trade-offs to come up with a successful
Sure.
negotiated outcome?
In terms of positive inducements, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of economic cooperation between North and South Korea that could be mutually beneficial for both parties and could be used as a trade-off for steps to denuclearize. Additionally, I don't think it's in anyone's interest to have an unstable North Korea, so providing some relief in terms of economic opportunities is not only beneficial for the Kim regime, which has emphasized, as Rona mentioned, survival, but also for China and South Korea, who don't want an unstable regime right on their borders.
Okay. Alexis, the question also come up about the regime collapse and the need for, I mean, you talk right about the necessity for thinking about and planning just in case that outcome were to become the result in the North. Do you want to just say a little bit about that?
As Ariane mentioned, we, in the first part of the book, talked about internal and external pressures, and I think there's some merit in thinking about those because there's many different ways that the regime could potentially collapse. It can come from a miscalculation, as we were talking about Trump, or it could come simply from within, internal dissension, especially from the military perspective, or some natural phenomenon where Kim Jong-un passed away or is assassinated. So thinking about those, and if the regime were to collapse, there are devastating consequences not only for South Korea and North Korea, but for China, Russia, and the United States. So it's in their interest to make sure that it doesn't collapse. And I think that's one of the biggest things that's keeping the regime together. And yeah, if anybody else.
I mean, you mentioned also, though, what do you say a little bit about, you talk about U.S.-China necessity to think about being prepared to see to it that we don't get into an inadvertent conflict over a possible, both sides kind of coming in and trying to fill a vacuum if a vacuum were to appear in North Korea. Do you want to? Yeah, which I think is a very important point here, just in case this.
I briefly talked about this, so I can mention it. One of the biggest catastrophic events that could happen from a regime collapse is if China decided to go into North Korea to protect its border, or the ROK could come in and make sure to either forcefully reunify,
to help or with the help of the United States, and that could cause additional catastrophe because of the forces of China and the U.S. clashing. One of the, what was the other part you wanted me to talk about?
Well, I mean, there might be questions, particularly if there were loose nukes or other kinds of WMD that you know, there might be competition to try to get control over that, and I mean, in particular, I think, you know, what you emphasized was the danger that we might inadvertently get into some kind of conflict with China, particularly the United States and or South Korea moved up to the, you know, repeated 1950 all over again and moved up to the Yellow River and so forth, and the necessity to kind of think about that scenario in advance, not because it's necessarily going to happen, but because if it did, prior coordination between the United States and China could be very critical in seeing that it doesn't lead to an inadvertent major conflict between two really well-armed nuclear states. Oh.
I think you covered it.
Okay. Are any other further questions then? Or comments from any of our?
Hi, Sang Young-yoon. Was in the class of 2016 with the conflict management program, so it's kind of good to be back. And I just, our group went to Sri Lanka, so I think you guys experience more modern like conflict site in a sense. So my question is, so now that I'm back on campus, I try to do my best to conceptualize the situation, especially through the lens that I learned from the class. And the only thing I kind of got away that I can still clearly remember is the concept of mutually hurting stalemate, which was not mentioned in this session. So I'm curious whether the panel, or especially Professor Vukovic, think that the parties, now that the summit is gonna being held like in a few hours, so the two parties, especially South Korea and North Korea, will be followed by United States as well. Are they actually in a mutually hurting stalemate? Especially like North Korea, it could be sanctions. South Korea and U.S. alliance, it could be the wedge, the North Korean effort to drive a wedge between the two allies. So I'm curious whether they are in a mutually hurting stalemate and how much it hurts, and whether the degree of the hurting is kind of different to each other, and how will affect the negotiation. Sorry to keep you guys to the on the way to the buzz and everything.
Okay, we mentioned the absence of a mutually enticing opportunity, but is there a sufficient mutually stalemate? And then I'd like to ask Carrie also to talk about the question of whether or not there's a possibility that these negotiations could drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea and somehow disrupt this U.S.-South Korean alliance. And then we better bring the session to a close. But Sinisa.
Thank you for asking that question. I try to kind of summarize it as a sum of insights from the report. And in fact, the question really is, how ripe is this situation for actual solution, or is this just buying time and a potential for just stalling, catching a breath, and then continuing business as usual? As you know, the idea behind the mutually hurting stalemate is a perceptive one, so that the parties really have to kind of articulate the way they perceive the ongoing situation. And if we see the way the parties are projecting the existing stalemate, because it is a form of a stalemate, even though they are showing propensity also to escalate if needed, they are not articulating it as if they are trying to avoid a catastrophe that is looming in the near future. So my impression right now, especially reflecting on what the report is showing, is that it's really no longer about whether or not it's a stalemate. It is sufficiently painful. Maybe it's not completely painful for all parties to kind of immediately look for a way out. But the problem about this pain is that the real gain from the negotiations is still not sufficiently formulated, which undermines the extent of perceptiveness, how unbearable the situation is. So really, when it comes to kind of keeping the parties locked into these negotiations, is not just to remind them how unbearable this ongoing tug of war is. It's actually to showing that they can gain something exclusively from these talks. But this exclusive set of issues that they need to discuss needs to provide mutual benefits. The problem about the ongoing talks is willingness to accept that the other side will gain something out of it. And this is the biggest problem about the lack of enticing opportunities, because they're mutually enticing opportunities, not exclusive enticing opportunities. And the lack of acceptance of, going back to your question, is there a win-win, that the other side will also win? To fathom the idea that the other side will gain something out of these talks instead of just reducing the pressure is something that we need to see how far, especially when it comes to the United States, is willing to articulate. And we have seen the same path going in the Iran nuclear talks, in which reduction of sanctions was not enough to create enticing opportunities. And that is why we see different diagnosis of the viability of that conflict resolution right now vis-a-vis Americans and Europeans. Because, Europeans saw it as a constructive engagement on other issues other than just the nuclear deal. Americans saw it only as a reduction of sanctions in return for the nuclear deal. If we pursue the same path, we may end up with the same results. That's why I conceptualize it as short-term versus long-term kind of prospects of who wants to gain what from these actual talks. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, to cite Bill Zartman, the mutually hurting stalemate is not only about current hurt. It can also involve a mutual perception of the cliff ahead, falling off of the precipice into the chasm. And creating that perception is an obvious stimulus to negotiation, as our dear friend and colleague Bill Zartman has written on numerous occasions and presented many, I think, persuasive examples of how that can push people towards negotiation. And that seems to me to be more applicable here than actual hurt to the regimes. I mean, the regime in the North may have some fears about its longevity, but on the other hand, the folks at the top who are making the policy decisions are not hurting immediately in the same sense that in the traditional hurting stalemate, the parties would be hurting. So, Carrie, do you want to say something very quickly about the possibility that this whole process could actually be a North Korean effort to drive a wedge into the U.S.-South Korean alliance?
Yeah, sure.
Which is a frequently brought up point in this country.
Yeah, thank you. So my paper topic dealt with the transfer of wartime operational control, or OPCON. In this topic, which is a very controversial topic within South Korea, I think arguably in the U.S. as well, I think there is kind of there is an effort from the North Korean side to drive a wedge between the U.S. and the ROK. There is there are themes about the U.S. being overly aggressive military posture with an increasingly imperialist stance. In some other, kind of on the flip side of that coin, is that the ROK is a puppet of the U.S. So it's these kind of propaganda themes from the DPRK that we're seeing that certainly are driving a wedge in the alliance. What I argue in my paper, though, is that the transfer of wartime operational control, while it is a very controversial policy, will actually serve to strengthen the U.S.-ROK alliance by bolstering the security of and the defense capabilities of the ROK. The kind of underpinning of the argument, though, is that the U.S. must retain its extended deterrence posture in the ROK and work on confidence-building measures in lockstep with the ROK. In many cases, it has to be ROK-led. But I think this is just one strategy among many in the world of confidence-building measures, where the U.S. and ROK really have to be united and really solidify its alliance, renew its alliance, make it as concrete as possible in order to present a united front to the DPRK. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank you all for coming and invite you to a reception next door, and thank all of the paper givers and everyone who contributed to this volume. Fantastic.